you've been lied to. And I don't mean just some little white lie to spare your feelings. We are talking about a massive systemic deception regarding what it actually takes to master a complex skill or unlock radical creativity. The lie tells you that if you just sit quietly at a desk, carefully organize your notes, memorize the rules, and highlight your textbooks until your eyes bleed, you are learning. But the reality is that those hours you spend obsessively organizing information are actually trapping your potential in a mental prison. This breakdown of the illusion of studying and how to actually master any skill can also be found on our website, knowlater.com. Let's get into it. We are conditioned from a very young age to treat cognitive abilities like physical traits, almost like height or eye color. It's the whole idea of the creative gene. This notion that some people are just born with a magical spark, and well, you aren't, is a complete myth. It is totally fabricated. When we look at the science of twin studies, they prove that only about 22% of creativity is heritable. And it gets crazier, because even that tiny fraction vanishes entirely when you control for general IQ. Your genes are absolutely not your destiny. Your habits, your environment, and your tolerance for acute cognitive discomfort, that is what builds a genius. It is entirely about rewiring the machine. Let's unpack this. Why is it that someone can ace every single written language test, score flawlessly on a multiple-choice grammar exam, and then completely freeze in terror when they actually have to speak to a real human being? Imagine you've memorized an entire French dictionary on your phone, but the second a tourist in Paris asks you for basic directions, your mind goes completely blank. It's awful, and we've all lived some version of it, but it exposes the deepest flaw in our educational framework. We are trained to optimize for what linguist Noam Chomsky categorized as competence rather than performance. Competence is the internal, theoretical grasp of a subject. It is your ability to look at a complex equation on a piece of paper, analyze it, and intellectually recognize its structure without a ticking clock. But performance is the brutal, real-time application of that knowledge in the wild, under social pressure, without a safety net. The reason that gap exists, the reason you lock up and totally forget the word for left or right while someone is staring at you, comes down to the literal physical architecture of human memory. When we rely entirely on declarative memory during our learning process, we are making a catastrophic error in our brain's routing system. Declarative memory, which is housed in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, is essentially your internal archival storage. It's the filing cabinet doing all the heavy lifting to encode factual information, like historical dates or rigid grammar rules. But the archival process is inherently slow. The brilliant physicist Richard Feynman diagnosed this trap perfectly. He learned from a very young age that knowing the name of a concept in 5 different languages teaches you absolutely nothing about the nature of the concept itself. It only teaches you about the history of human linguistics. We suffer from a profound illusion of competence when we memorize jargon. Think about the mechanics of a car engine. You can go to school and memorize the terminology. You confidently throw around words like alternator, combustion chamber, and torque. You sound incredibly intelligent at a dinner party. But if a curious 5-year-old child points under the hood and asks, "How does the car actually move forward?" and your only response is to recite the textbook definition of an internal combustion engine, you don't actually understand the machine. You are hiding behind a linguistic shield. If you can't explain the raw mechanism, how a tiny controlled explosion pushes a metal piston down which turns a crank, which ultimately spins the wheels, you possess labels, not knowledge. This brings us to a diagnostic tool called the Feynman test. And let me tell you, it is entirely unforgiving. The test mandates that after learning any new concept, you must be able to explain it simply, using concrete, real-world analogies, without relying on a single piece of industry jargon. When you attempt this, you will immediately feel a cognitive stutter. You will instinctively reach for a buzzword because the buzzword does the heavy lifting for you. It's a crutch. I see this constantly in corporate environments. People throw around words like agile transformation or cloud computing in meetings, and everyone just nods sagely because they're terrified to ask what it means. But if you stop the meeting and say, "Explain how the cloud works," without using the words server, network, or remote, the room goes dead silent. The Feynman test strips away the armor of declarative memory and forces you to prove true procedural understanding. Moving from rigidly hoarding labels to generating true, adaptable understanding requires us to fundamentally alter how we operate our brains. We have to move away from the rote memorization centers and start orchestrating the networks responsible for original thought, which means we need to talk about the two networks of creativity. For decades, pop psychology sold us the myth of the logical left brain versus the creative right brain. Thankfully, modern science has completely dismantled that model. Creativity isn't a localized zip code in the brain. It is the dynamic interaction between large-scale neural networks. The two most critical for our operational system are the executive control network and the default mode network. If I need a file, I have to consciously pause, walk down into the mental basement, locate the correct drawer, thumb through the folders, and finally extract the data. You are doing administrative paperwork in your head while a living, breathing human is waiting for you to speak. Accessing declarative memory is a conscious, metabolically expensive process. But conversation operates on a microscopic timeline. The brutal math of human interaction dictates that you have roughly 0.3 to 0.5 seconds to respond to a question before the silence becomes socially unnatural. That is nothing. It's an instant. If your brain has to route a request down to your declarative memory to consciously construct a sentence, check the grammar, and send it back to your motor cortex, the moment is completely gone. The knowledge is there, locked in the filing cabinet, screaming to get out, but the retrieval mechanism is fundamentally incompatible with the speed of reality. It is exactly like trying to learn how to swim by locking yourself in a library for 6 months with a dense physics manual on fluid dynamics. You sit there memorizing the equations for buoyancy. You calculate the exact displacement of water based on body mass. You pass a written exam on aquatic physics with a flawless score. You possess absolute declarative competence. But the second you jump into the deep end of an actual pool, all that competence is entirely useless. As you start to sink, you don't have the cognitive bandwidth to retrieve the physics equation for drag, calculate the required adjustment, and send the signal to your arms. The filing cabinet is too slow. You are going to drown. Because the physical act of staying afloat and propelling yourself bypasses the hippocampus almost entirely. It relies on procedural memory, which is housed in entirely different neurological structures, primarily the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. Procedural memory is fast, automatic, and totally unconscious. You don't think about the micro-movements required to tie your shoes. The motor sequence just fires as a single chunk of data. Declarative memory cannot smoothly transition into procedural memory just by reading the physics manual harder. You cannot analyze your way into fluency. You actually have to jump in the water, flail around, swallow some pool water, and let your brain physically calibrate your motor neurons through the immediate feedback of your environment. This distinction exposes a really dangerous cognitive trap. Our educational systems reward us for filling up the declarative filing cabinet with labels, and we mistake that for actual mastery. We end up walking around with a completely unearned sense of confidence because we assume that possessing the vocabulary for a concept means we possess the underlying mechanism. But vocabulary is just the map, it's never the territory. Think of the executive control network like a ruthless air traffic controller in your prefrontal cortex. It stands at the center of your consciousness, maintaining absolute order and ruthlessly blocking out any distracting sensory input so you can focus on the task at hand. It keeps you locked onto a complex spreadsheet or focused on the road during a heavy rainstorm. It is analytical, sequential, and entirely intolerant of deviation. Its entire job is optimization. But here is the catch. Efficiency is the sworn enemy of originality. When you are highly focused, your brain is actively preventing you from making bizarre tangential connections. Which brings us to the default mode network, or the DMN. This network flares to life the exact moment you stop focusing. It activates when you are daydreaming, staring out a window on a train, or standing in the shower. If the executive control network is the strict air traffic controller, the default mode network is like a chaotic improv comedy troupe. It completely ignores the rules, pulls memories from your childhood, mashes them up with a movie you saw yesterday, and just sees what happens. The prevailing cultural myth is that creative geniuses just have a hyperactive default mode network, that they are perpetually lost in their own eccentric daydreams. But neurobiology shows us something entirely different. The defining superpower of exceptional thinkers is a trait called cognitive flexibility. It is the ability to rapidly and seamlessly couple these two networks. Exceptional creators allow the default mode network to run wild, generating bizarre, divergent associations. They let the improv troupe play. But the moment a spark of a genuinely original idea appears, they immediately toggle back to the executive control network. They bring the strict controller back in to discipline the idea, critique its flaws, test it against reality, and refine it into a viable product. The problem is that our modern technological environment actively sabotages this process. We have built an ecosystem that demands the executive control network be engaged constantly. The moment we feel a second of boredom, we pull out a phone, scroll a feed, or answer an email. We are perpetually processing external input, which means the default mode network is perpetually suppressed. We never let the chaotic ideas out of the cage because we view daydreaming as an unproductive waste of time. But unfocused time is a strict biological requirement for memory consolidation and creative insight. You have to strategically engineer unfocused time into your daily routines. You have to tolerate the initial discomfort of understimulation so your neural pathways can actually reorganize themselves. The gap between who you are right now and who you want to be isn't a lack of inherent talent. It is the willingness to step out of the library and walk into the messy, uncomfortable arena of active output. It is the courage to let your brain physically rewire itself through the sheer unrelenting force of trying, failing, and adapting. What safety net in your life do you need to cut today in order to finally start learning? And that is the illusion of studying, translated. I'm your host, and this is Knowlator, your knowledge translator. For more breakdowns, head over to knowlator.com. Even when we do step away from the screens, we hit another biological wall. The human brain is a massive energy-hoarding machine. Because of its immense metabolic cost, the brain is ruthlessly designed to take the path of least resistance. It wants to solve problems as quickly and cheaply as possible. This physiological drive manifests as the trap of the first right answer, a phenomenon called premature closure. You see this in brainstorming sessions all the time. A team is presented with a complex problem. They throw out ideas, and within 10 minutes someone suggests a solution that technically works. It's not brilliant, it's not innovative, but it is viable. Immediately you can feel the collective energy in the room deflate. The brain says, "Thank God we have an answer," and slams the mental door shut to stop spending energy. Average thinkers snap to that first viable solution. Creative thinkers, however, train themselves to fight the biological urge to quit. They force themselves to marinate in the profound discomfort of ambiguity, recognizing that the first 5 answers are merely the obvious, low-hanging fruit retrieved from predictable neural pathways. Let's test this right now with a divergent thinking exercise. Imagine a standard wire coat hanger. I want you to imagine 20 entirely different uses for that single object. The initial phase is effortless. Hanging shirts, unlocking a car door, roasting marshmallows, unclogging a vacuum, a makeshift paper towel holder. And right there at number 5, you hit a massive wall. It actually hurts to think of number 6. Your executive control network steps in and says, "We have exhausted the household category. The exercise is over." That physical frustration is the literal depletion of neurotransmitters in your established associative networks. But if you refuse closure, if you force the door to remain open, your brain is compelled to abandon the obvious linguistic pathways. It fires up the default mode network to search for remote categories. You stop looking at the hanger as a closet tool and start looking at its raw physical properties, its flexible steel wire. Suddenly, the breakthrough happens. It becomes an emergency welding rod, an antenna for a broken radio, a structural frame for a sculpture, a conductive wire for a science experiment. The true magic of divergent thinking only occurs after the obvious answers are exhausted. Highly creative individuals possess what psychologists call flatter associative hierarchies. In a rigid brain, the concept of a hanger is heavily insulated, only connecting to words like clothes or closet. The electrical signal can't make the leap to electronics or art. But a brain with a flat hierarchy has cultivated a sprawling web of connections. The mental filing cabinet has been kicked over, and files are physically overlapping with concepts they were never meant to touch. How do we systematically force our brains to build these flatter networks? We use conceptual blending, achieved through relentless cross-training outside of our primary domains. You have to force disparate fields of knowledge to collide. The most profound, metabolically demanding way to force the brain to flatten its hierarchy is learning a foreign language. It is the ultimate cognitive hack. When you only speak English, your perception of reality is strictly confined by that specific vocabulary. Take the word love. In English, love is a massive, impenetrable monolith. You love your spouse, your dog, pizza, a good movie. It's a catch-all bucket. But cross-train your brain by exploring ancient Greek, and you discover they didn't view love as a monolith. They had distinct concepts: eros for romantic passion, philia for deep friendship, and agape for unconditional love. By internalizing that distinction, your brain now possesses entirely different conceptual frameworks to evaluate reality. When faced with a rough patch in a relationship, a monolingual brain only evaluates the problem through the monolith. We lost our love. But the cross-trained brain can shift perspectives. We lost the eros for the moment, but we still have massive philia, so we have the foundation to rebuild. You have literally expanded the raw material your brain has available to generate novelty. But getting to that point is deeply, viscerally uncomfortable. It makes us feel totally incompetent. And here's the secret. It is supposed to feel incompetent. That cognitive friction is the absolute prerequisite for neurological growth. By removing friction from our lives, we remove the very mechanism that forces the myelin sheath to wrap around our neural pathways and solidify learning. Without friction, there is no myelin. We are looking for desirable difficulties. The sweet spot of cognitive strain that forces the brain to release neurochemicals like dopamine and BDNF, which promote neuroplasticity. This maps onto the flow state, where you are operating at the absolute limit of your potential. Flow only occurs when the challenge perfectly matches your current skill level. Too easy, and you get bored. Too hard, and your amygdala triggers anxiety. Flow exists entirely in the narrow channel between boredom and anxiety, the space just an inch beyond your current capability. Because we have been conditioned to avoid mental strain, we fall into the illusion of productivity. We substitute the hard neurological work of learning with the comfortable task of organizing. This is the person who spends 3 entire days building the perfect color-coded Excel spreadsheet instead of making one terrifying sales call. They feel productive, but they haven't actually forced their brain to process the underlying challenge. If you are not somewhat frustrated by the material, you are not learning. You are just reviewing. Before we summarize how to apply this to your daily routine and truly upgrade your operating system, just a quick reminder that you can find more knowledge translated at nolater.com. So, how do we take the concept of procedural memory, flatter hierarchies, and desirable difficulties and build a tactical operating system? The goal is to transition your brain from a passive storage facility into a dynamic execution engine. First, flip the 80-20 rule. Currently, people spend 80% of their time passively consuming input, reading books, watching tutorials. That only feeds the declarative memory system. To build procedural fluency, you must ruthlessly shift your allocation to 80% active output. If you are a writer, stop reading essays about narrative structure and force yourself to produce terrible pages. Engage the motor pathways. The brain only learns how to execute a skill through the physical act of production. Second, to bypass the sluggish filing cabinet, use a technique called shadowing. If you want to become a charismatic public speaker, don't just read a book on tonality. Put on a video of a great speaker and shadow them. Speak their exact words out loud, lingering only a half second behind their voice. You are literally chasing their cadence and matching their emphasis in real time. Because of that microscopic delay, your brain has absolutely no time to route the information through the analytical executive control network. You force your motor neurons to physically execute the pattern. Third, use the monologue marathon to fight premature closure. Set a strict timer for 5 minutes and select a random mundane topic like a yellow number 2 pencil. The only rule is that you cannot stop speaking for the entire 5 minutes. You will exhaust all the obvious talking points about graphite and erasers within 45 seconds. Panic will set in. But because you cannot stop talking, you force your brain to scramble. You start making remote associations about the geometry of hexagons or the deforestation impact of mass production. You are training your brain to navigate the chaos of ambiguity without shutting down. Finally, you must embrace the ugly phase. We look at brilliant creators and see the polished final product. We don't see the thousands of hours of sheer humiliating incompetence it took to build those procedural networks. Every genius you admire once produced absolute garbage. The ugly phase is not a detour, it is the path itself. Our nervous system is hardwired to protect us from looking incompetent in public, interpreting social embarrassment as an existential threat. To achieve mastery, you have to consciously override that ancient survival programming. You have to willingly pay the toll of public failure. If you protect your ego, you protect your ignorance. Construct no escape zones in your life. If you want to do stand-up comedy, sign up for an open mic and leave your notes in your pocket. Force your brain to survive entirely in the territory instead of retreating to the safety of the map.